I think we're on the 2 to 3 minute countdown.
Good evening. Welcome to Space for Grace this evening. We are sitting in the round tonight because our dinner is going to be afterward. We're going to be going to On the Border, and we got the side dining room. That way we can be more in conversation with our guest speaker, Mary. And so before we start our worship time, can I have a raise of hand if you are going to be going to dinner? That way I can count. All right. Well, we're going to sing together for everyone born, and the papers are at your seats. We're going to be singing verses 1, 2, 4, and 6. 1, 2, 4, and 6. Let us sing together.
Let's go. For everyone born, a place at the table. For everyone born, clean water and bread. A shelter, a space, a safe place for growing. For everyone born, a star overhead. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. Yes, God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy. For all who share life, a place at the table, revising the roles, deciding the share. With wisdom and grace, dividing the power. For all who share life, a system that's fair. But God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. Yes, God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy. Verse 4. For all who have breath, a place at the table, a covenant shared, a welcoming space, a rainbow of race and gender and color. For all who have breath, the chalice of grace. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. Yes, God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy. Verse 6. For everyone born, a place at the table, to live without fear and simply to be to work, to speak out, to witness and worship. For everyone born the right to be free. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. Yes, God will delight when we are creators of justice and justice and joy. Thank you, Anna Faye. Jim, will you come up and introduce our speaker?
Welcome to all of you this evening. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm delighted that we have as our guest this evening Mary Carter, who's going to be speaking to us. We are involved together in the work of the Human Community Network, and Mary has met with our group and spoken to us and made this presentation to our group. And she expressed an interest in taking her show on the road, so to speak. She's happy to meet with people and share this story. But she and I tonight met for the first time in person. We've only known each other from here up on Zoom. So it's a delight to meet Mary in person and to welcome her here this evening. She is an economist. And I can't tell you even if she goes to church or what church she goes to, but what I can tell you is that she is a person who is concerned about justice and joy and compassion and peace. And she's here tonight with a message that addresses what is important for the whole human community. Mary, we welcome you here tonight.
Well, just so you know, I do go to church. I'm an Episcopalian, so I go to St. John's Church in Norman, Oklahoma. And yes, I am involved in the outreach committee and, trying to do what we can to make our community better and healthier. Okay, just a little more on my background. I have an MBA with an emphasis in finance and economics. I worked for over 14 years in banking, both large and small banks, and when I left, I was the vice president over loan administration. Then I went to work for the last 10 years of my career for the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, working as a commission compliance examiner and later as a safety and soundness examiner. And during this time when I was working in banking, for 5 years I taught at OCU at night in economics. And it was economics and quality of life. And I really loved teaching that because everyone had to take that class. And I said, you may think you don't like economics, but I said, you're going to be a player, so you might as well know the rules of the game. So anyway, a couple of things to preempt this. What we have today in the United States, which I'm sure you're very aware of, is a rigged system. And it's all propped up by the rich and powerful and by a very effective propaganda campaign that's been going on for 40 years. So you have to realize, I'm going to be digging down tonight into why are we here? How did we get here? To give us an idea of how we can get out of this hole we're in. So I'll be talking about the way inequality is created and maintained in the United States, and ultimately how this impacts individuals and communities and the rest of the nation. This is finally being studied systematically, and I was really excited. When I teach OLLI classes, I have to create my own curriculum. So when I decided I wanted to do this, I was out on the internet just looking for books and articles and anything I could find, and I was very pleased to find there's a lot of stuff going on out there. And one of the quotes I'm going to give you is actually from a major bank that's beginning to recognize that there are real problems. And they are the ones I'm going to use that really quantified how much money it's costing our economy every year because of just discrimination against black people, not to count all the rest of the stuff. So I'll be showing just a couple of graphs and some statistics showing the growing levels of inequality, but we'll try to look deeper behind the numbers and not just the graph. There are overall, where I'm coming out as far as how we approach this, and I'll get into that more towards the end of the presentation, but that there are just too many changes needed, that we need to have a public-private partnership, because the government needs to do the groundwork, which I think the current administration is making a good attempt at that, where you make sure that the people are taken care of. So you have all of the infrastructure that's needed, things like health care, child care, targeted education, and regulations that require a equal playing field for all the people, not because we're going to get into what the rich and powerful have been able to do for themselves and why this so contributes to inequality. So I hope you're going to have a much better understanding when I finish this of how this all got started and maybe what we can do about it. And I thought it's important with a program like this to make it clear that I really believe in capitalism. I grew up in a family, my dad had a small business, so we were very pro-business Republicans. And, but I'm thinking of the capitalism that I was taught in school, which was the three-legged stool. You had the shareholders, the stakeholders, which were the people who worked at the company, and the community in which the company was located. And all three of those were equal. Now that's all changed, and it's only the shareholder that matters. And I'll tell you how that all happened. Okay, but I do believe that we need to get back to the old-fashioned capitalism. I mean, you need to have that freedom. You want to encourage a lot of innovation and new businesses. And by the way, the rich people are not the job creators. You know, we're always told that you need another tax break for the job creators because we're all dependent on the job creators. We're not. Now, there may be a certain number of people that follow in that top category that initially, when they started Amazon or they started PayPal, yes, they did create a lot of jobs. But once they get money, they become very risk adverse. And you'll hear, you know, claims that, oh, well, they're in these venture capital things, you know, and they're really helping people get started. Not so much. What really happens is they're very, very particular about the businesses they will invest any money in, and then if it looks like it's going to turn out to be anything really profitable, they want their cut. So you have to watch out for all of that. But, okay, so the key to the entire class is a phrase by, that I found this by Professor Frankfurt. And he said, you know, there's always going to be a level of inequality. We're not going to all have the same. Some people will have more, other people will have less. But what matters is that the people who have less do not have enough. And that's where we're really falling down in our economy today and often around the world, is that even if the people who had less had a decent life, you know, housing, food, education for their children, a good standard of living, it wouldn't matter that some people have more. But we are getting to the point where the people who have less and less and less. Okay, So I think now I will go to that slide with the YouTube. I had been looking for this for years and finally found it, and it's kind of old information, so just take what he says and realize it's much, much worse now than in, I think he's looking at possibly 2009, something like that. Okay. Whoop. We're gonna have a cartoon. Yeah, wealth inequality. There we go.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution, shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash, and let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about, something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here's the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
So, that's rather sobering to see what's really happening in our country, and then it seems even more outrageous to think that the top 1% always wants another tax break. It's like, you've got way too much already. But I think there is a level at which people greed just grows exponentially, apparently. As a person gets rich, they just need more and more and more and more. And I think sometimes it actually has to do with, we don't have battles on the field anymore with knights charging each other and proving their prowess, but you can, because my pile of money is bigger than your pile of money. And the minute you get more, then I need to get more so that I will look better than you. So I just, that's my take on that. I'm not saying it, I've read that anywhere. Okay, so how in the world did we ever get to that point? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Well, one of the first things is tax policy. And I think we all realize in this room that the tax policy has just really been skewed for the rich. So, and all in the name of, well, we have to give them more tax breaks because if we want the economy to grow, you know, they're the ones who are going to do it. That's not true, and it's really, like I said, they're really risk adverse. So who is it that does create the jobs? The middle class. Because people in the middle class will risk everything to try a new business. They'll mortgage their home, they'll run up their credit cards, they'll do whatever it takes to try to get that little fledgling company started. And that's not what the rich are doing, for sure. Okay. Of course, another problem that has hurt the middle class in this country is globalization, and I know we hear a lot about that. But one of the things I feel like that's happening now is with the Great Recession that we had, is that we're beginning to realize we need to manufacture more at home. And of course, a lot of us could have told them that a long time ago, but you know, they were outsourcing everywhere. And of course, I was reading about this in a lot of the journals clear back in the 80s when I was getting my master's degree and we were studying this kind of thing, and how they were really scared at that point that companies were going to start chasing around the world to find the cheapest labor with the least benefits. And indeed, that's what's been happening. And I realize even when the Chinese, they were one of the first places we went as a country, and finally the Chinese started really gaining a lot of skills and thinking they should demand more money and better benefits. So what happens? These American conglomerates move to India, and then the people in India start working their way up, and so let's go to Bangladesh. So I mean, it's just been this horrible, horrible cycle of chasing around after the cheapest labor. So I think now we're finally waking up that this is, of course, dangerous to have a lot of your critical products being created overseas, and so we want to bring a lot of that back home. Now, we will see how long this lasts. I'm hoping that it's just a new trend and we're not going back to the old ways. Of course, there's been increased automation, and that really cuts both ways. I can see a way that it could actually work. You know, we're kind of facing a smaller workforce because families aren't as big as they used to be. So with that, it would be great if, say, the real menial jobs that were so hard to fill were just done by robots or artificial intelligence or something like that. And then we could really focus on giving the people that need a job a better job and a better paying job. So we'll see how that goes. Then the decline in unions, because now the corporations have all the power, and they have really used it in a very abusive way by holding down wages and benefits artificially to try to make more money because of this whole thing of the shareholder reigns supreme. So one of the things too is that we've noticed unions are starting to have a little bit of a comeback, and it's spreading from manufacturing to people like in the service community, which Amazon is finally getting hit. Walmart's getting hit again. You know, they've been trying to organize Walmart for years and years. A girlfriend of mine, her husband worked for the union, and she said he always hated when he got the assignment to go back and try to organize Walmart. You know, it was just a punishment because they just couldn't get anywhere. So, all right, I've got, so you can see there the wealth gap. So let's move on to another slide. Sorry. Okay, and that's what I'm talking about here, and I'm not going into all of these, but I will finish up with race, gender disparities and salary gaps. Okay, go to the next one, I think maybe. Okay, this one I thought was worth putting on a slide. I know that's a lot to read, but this is where I was so surprised. Citigroup, of all things, and these big banks have really good economists working for them. So apparently they got concerned enough that they decided this needed to be studied. So this new study puts out that they have identified exactly how much money is being lost. I lost my page here. Okay. So overall, they think $16 trillion was lost over a 20-year period. So basically, we're looking at a loss of about $1 trillion a year, just because of discrimination against African Americans. And they really broke it down to try to quantify it. So we've got $13 trillion lost in potential business revenue because of discriminatory lending to African American entrepreneurs, with an estimate of 6.1 million jobs not generated as a result. We are biting our nose to spite our face. Okay, 2.7 trillion in income lost because of disparities in wages suffered by African Americans. $218 billion lost over the past 2 decades because of discrimination in providing a housing credit, and $90 billion to $113 billion in lifetime income lost from discrimination in accessing higher education. So, and not acting to reverse these discriminatory practices will continue to extract a cost. Citigroup estimates the economy would see a $5 trillion boost over the next 5 years if the U.S. were to tackle key areas of discrimination against African Americans. So $1 trillion a year we are giving up because we insist on discriminating against people of color. So income inequality is most severe along race and gender lines, and with women and people of color hit the hardest. On average, men earn 68% more than their female counterparts. Can you believe after all this time, women have been fighting and fighting for years to get equal pay for equal work, and we still haven't gotten there. And of course, the lowest paid demographic is actually Hispanic females. So that's just really sad that they work hard and they just can't get anywhere. So the income, the salary gaps overall, the income inequality that we have today mostly comes from the wide pay gaps. At the very top are the top executives who have seen their average compensation grow nearly tenfold between 1960 and 2010. College-educated workers in general have fared far better than average, seeing their wages nearly double over that time period. By comparison, workers with less than a high school diploma have seen no growth in real wages over the same period. In turn, these salary differences contribute to wealth inequality. Unlike most workers, top earners rarely spend all that they make in a year, and over time they build up savings. So that's one of the major problems. So now it's income is falling. And I did ignore that on the left there with the bars. I don't find that very easy to read. But on the right here, it's pretty simple. So in 1970, 62% of all of the income that was made in the United States, the middle class got 62% of that, which makes sense. We're the largest number of people. And now in 2018, and like I said, these numbers have only gotten worse. I'm sorry I couldn't get something more current, but this was as close as I could get. They're down to 43%. Now look what happened to the upper income people. They were at 29%, they're now up to 48%. So they're coming close now, and I wouldn't be surprised now if they earn half of all of the income in the United States. And then the poor folks at the bottom were at 10% in 1970 and only made it down to 9% by 2018. So that is a real problem. I was going to go through several of the myths about poverty, but I'm just going to hit on one. You know, we always get the impression that the worst poverty is in the inner cities. And, you know, other than that, people are doing okay. And they said no. The statistics actually are that only 10 to 15% of the poor reside in high poverty neighborhoods in inner cities. So where are the rest of us? So it's in the suburbs, but some of the worst is in rural areas in America. And working as a bank examiner, I traveled all over the states. Well, my district was Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Nebraska. And once you get off the major highways, the poverty is staggering. And you go into these little towns, and we'd be examining a bank. Excuse me. So I'd be examining a bank and I'd look around downtown and the little town is boarded up. They maybe had a restaurant. They maybe had a school. They probably didn't have a hospital. The bank was about the last holdout for a decent job and a decent building to work in. It was so, so sad. So, and a lot of these banks are owned by men, and I've been out of the biz for a while, by men in their 80s. And they were begging one of their children to come back and run the bank. This little tiny town, the son already has a really good job someplace else and isn't real interested in coming back and running the bank. So I thought, oh my gosh, when this bank closes, it'll either become a branch of a bigger bank like Bank First will sometimes, you know, if they can see a way to make some money on it, they'll do it. But other than that, the town's just going to be dried up and gone. So, okay, on to another slide here. Okay, so it's important to look beyond, just the economics, you know, the financial costs. What we're seeing today is extremely predictable in that, look at our political polarization. People are getting divided up against each other. And this is where that propaganda campaign really comes into play. You know, people are just being convinced that Ronald Reagan was right. If somebody shows up at your door and says, I'm here, I'm with the federal government and I'm here to help you, you know, that's always the problem. And that it's all this onerous regulation that is causing all of these problems. And the people will promise that, you know, everything's going to be great when we totally dismantle the federal government. We don't want all these programs because programs mean regulations and all that stuff. So let's get rid of all of that. And everybody's going to be free. I mean, you can discriminate against anybody you want to. You can do anything with your land that you want to. Nobody can tell you what to do. Isn't that going to be wonderful? So people, you know, on the surface, they think, oh, it's just going to be freedom. I'm all for freedom. I want that. They don't understand that this is all being carried out by the rich so that they can fleece them. Because when there are no rules and regulations, what happens? Okay, so then the stymied economic growth, and that really comes from what we were just talking about here of all of this discrimination, and now that they're trying to quantify it, they can see there are real dollars and cents behind all of this stuff, and it makes a difference. So it's really hurting us to continue to discriminate. Then decrease social mobility. And at first you think, well, like, you mean moving around? No, moving up. You know, in the United States, there are all these rags to riches, you know, there's a mythology about that. The reality is that in the United States, 1 in 25 children ever makes it out of poverty. In Europe, it's 1 out of 6 makes it out of poverty. So we are doing a terrible, terrible job of giving people that opportunity to grow out of poverty. And of course, if you lock a kid in a poor area with abusive parents, no education, not enough food, and then we're surprised that the children grow up to be very dysfunctional. So we've got to start addressing all of this. Oh, and then my little comment is that where you have high poverty level, you have high rates of crime. People often don't put that together, but I don't know why. Because when you're living in an area where there's no other way to make a living but to do drugs, sell drugs, meth. Why do we have meth in the rural areas in Oklahoma? You think, oh, well, that'd be a big city thing. No, it was the only way they could get by. And I heard a story on NPR one day where they were talking to someone, and he said, well, I live in this little rural town, but there was a nice manufacturing plant down the road, and so I was working there for years and had a nice salary and a nice home, and I bought myself a new truck and all this kind of stuff. And then they packed up and left. And so he started making meth and selling it, just as, a little stopgap, till I find a better job, till I can find another manufacturing plant or something. And it just time kept going by and going by and going by, and before he knew it, not only was he selling it full time, but he was also hooked on it. So, but people don't want to talk about that this is part of poverty. And if you could just address the poverty issue, it would automatically start cleaning up the crime issue. Okay. Best options to stop the funneling to the top. Okay. One of the things that people don't realize, so how did we get this thing all turned around where the shareholder reigns supreme and nobody else matters? Well, a big part of it happened in the 1980s, and we don't even realize how recent this is, but I taught us whole class on gross domestic product. And I thought a lot of people would think, why would I want to take a class on that? Because Mariana Mazzucato, I think it's The Cost of Everything, did all this research. She's an economist out of London University. And so she wrote this book where she goes into, in the 1980s, until that time, financial transactions, buying and selling shares of stock, was not reflected in our gross domestic product. And that's actually correct. It should never be in there, because all you're doing is trading things around. You're not creating any new jobs, any new money, other than to the person who's holding the stock and the person who buys the stock, and they do a trade between themselves, and then they move on to somebody else. But it's not, there's a money factor involved, and that's where they said, oh, well, we've got to count this, because you've got money exchanges. No, if it's not creating anything, then that doesn't improve or increase gross domestic product. So I did a whole class. I was surprised they stuck with me to the end, but they did. So the best ways to stop this, and of course I'm using a lot of this from Elizabeth Warren, but she talks about how you need to pass a wealth tax, because things have become so skewed. Now the wealthy are so much wealthier than everybody else. Everybody else has no chance to get caught up. So they are looking at something like that. So far, of course, this isn't catching on very well, and that goes back to the way the rich and powerful work. And I saw an example on a Robert Reich film, if anybody ever saw Inequality for All. At any rate, he had a good friend who was a senator, who had been a Republican senator who had retired. So Robert went in and he said, so how does this work? How do they get you to vote for tax breaks for them and reduced regulation for them and so forth? And he said, well, let me tell you how it works. So you have somebody come in your office that you know, and they step away, and introduce you to their friend. So the lobbyist then starts into, you've got another campaign coming up here soon, and you're going to need a lot of money, And you know, we gave you a lot of money the last time you ran, so we would really appreciate it if you do this and do that and do something else. And before you know it, you're a totally owned person by the rich and powerful. So that's how they've been doing this. So there's the propaganda on one side where they convince people, oh, folks, we are the job creators. You've got to give us the tax breaks or the whole economy's just going to collapse. And then there's this real working of the people in Congress. And I used to know the number. It's really large. It's something like over 60 lobbyists for every single person in the Congress. So these people are putting a lot of pressure on the people representing us. But Elizabeth Warren, my hero, and I knew her before she even ran for president or even senator, when I was in the consumer compliance area at the Federal Reserve. We went out to make sure the banks are all following the current compliance or in compliance with the regulations on fairly treating people. So I saw several little interviews with her. They'd actually show them at the Federal Reserve because she was working on various problems. And her big one then was this terrible thing when with credit cards, and how if you got behind on your credit card bill, not only did they raise your rate, but they kept hitting you with huge fines, and you'd keep getting farther behind on your payment, and so they just keep ratcheting it up, you know. And she said, this is horrible. These are people that need help, or they'd be paying their bills on time. So to have this punitive setup, so I think she did get some changes made there, and I know they did finally drop the interest rate, that you couldn't charge over a certain level of interest rate, but I don't know if that's lasted. And the other thing is the bankruptcy laws, which I know she's all excited about, but I was all excited about that too. They changed the bankruptcy laws so that, of course, for businesses, it's great. You can go in and declare bankruptcy, and the next day you reopen and everything's just fine. And then you just kind of work out on the edges, you know, with your attorneys on these people you owe money, and they usually have to they will take huge hits, the people that are owed the money, just to get something from you. Okay, now let's say it's me, and I declare bankruptcy. So, you can declare bankruptcy, but you can never leave. What happens is they'll say, okay, as long as you don't have any assets or any income, we won't pressure you. But the minute we find out you have a job, we're probably going to garnish your wages. So it's like, even though it used to be a clean slate, you know, you could declare bankruptcy, you could clear the decks, you could start building your credit over again. But now, it's just impossible. So I'm very upset about that. Okay, and of course the tax cuts that we had in 2017 went to the big corporations and the really rich. And so it gives you some numbers there. 39 mega corporations, including Amazon, reported more than 122 billion dollars in profits to the shareholders, using loopholes, deductions, and exemptions to pay the federal income tax of $0. And I did find something I think I'm going to have to skip, but it was over, have you ever heard of a group, ProPublica? Okay, so they have been doing some really interesting stuff. I had to subscribe to them so I'd get their stuff all the time, but they were talking about the fact that they got a hold of tax records, and they could actually get it down to the person and how much they were paying. So Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and, you know, the big names that we all know. And they were paying, on average, about 3.2%. If they paid anything at all, it wasn't more than 3.2%. We, on the other hand, our average is 7.2%. So something is seriously wrong here. Okay, so solutions to the problem. Not anything that's going to be easy. So we need higher taxes on the rich and on large corporations. We need new laws that forbid offshore accounts. Oh, and I did a whole class on that because that is just a horrible racket where they plant all their money in these accounts offshore and then they never have to pay taxes on it. Then there's, we need to eliminate loopholes used by the rich and corporations that allow them to avoid paying any taxes at all. And I think that was one of the things that went through in this latest, some of the latest legislation where there should be a 15% minimum tax. So I know that Janet Yellen, as the Treasury Secretary, was really working to get that in because she wants it to be worldwide. Because if only we put in a 15% and nobody else does, that it will only hurt us. Okay. Then we need, we need government regulations because corporations cannot be trusted to be good stewards of the economy and the country, always cutting wages, a quick way to improve returns, and also another thing they do, if you've heard of stock buybacks, that's a sneaky little trick. So corporations, instead of taking the money that could be declared as dividends, they take it and they buy back stock from some of their rich investors, so the investor makes the big money, but now the value of all of the shares, if say you had 10 million shares out there, and so the value was among all 10 million shares, you buy back 1 million, now there's only divided among 9 million. So it all went up. You didn't do anything. You didn't make any money, you didn't make a new product or provide a new service. You just manipulated it so that it looks like you made money. And we need government spending so that people will get help to succeed, including, of course, healthcare, daycare, safe neighborhoods, and eliminating all forms of discrimination. Okay, we got another slide. And how do we implement these? And this is about all I could come up with. This is my freelancing here. So on a local and state level, funding could be raised to develop small programs as a testing ground to see what can be done to improve educational and training opportunities, living conditions, child care, and neighborhoods. But will that be enough? And the problems have become so huge because funding has been cut from national budgets for years, creating all the societal problems we now face. And previously, programs like food stamps, welfare, and the income tax credit helped millions of people escape poverty and build a better life. But now those programs have been demonized and greatly defunded or eliminated. Now, along those lines, though, something's getting a lot more play than I thought. You've heard this guaranteed income thing. And they haven't gone quite so far as to guarantee income, but I know out in, I guess it was it Stockton, New Jersey or something, they tried this program where they would give people who qualified like an extra $150 a month. And they said, then they got feedback from the folks that got the money. Well, of course, so many people would say, oh, you don't want to do that because they're just going to take it out and buy booze and cigarettes, and drugs and all that. No, they didn't. They would use that money to take a day off from work so they could go look for a better job. They would use it to help pay for their daycare. So they really tried to get creative on how to use this extra money to improve their lives. So it really, so I think sometimes little programs can begin the snowball effect, because I've been reading that apparently more and more cities are looking into this kind of stuff. Okay, and in order to make meaningful systemic changes, voters need to elect people in local, state, and national government who are ready to restructure our current government systems to provide support and real opportunities to middle and working class people in America to allow them to thrive. So, that's it. That's all I could come up with. But and I do want to thank you for inviting me. This is what I wanted to do with my time, and I appreciate the opportunity, and you're being so welcoming. So, thanks.
Do I understand, Mary, you're going to join us at the dinner table?
Yes.
So that'll be an opportunity to ask our questions.
Yeah, I thought we could talk.
That'd be beautiful. Well, this was a different setup for today. I kind of like getting this kind of in the round, or a partial round. Thank you. While the cat's away, the mouse will play Glenda. But we will close with a time of prayer, and our response this evening will be, I'll say God of love, and I'll ask you to say, hear our prayer. And then we'll close with shalom to you at the end. So let's join our hearts in prayer. God of generations, we celebrate the lives of the women who fought the good fight and stood for the gospel and the truth of Scripture yesterday and today. Strengthen our voice of proclamation. God, in our love, hear our prayer. God of life, we give you thanks for the bold men among us throughout the ages who support and encourage women in their quest to use their God-given gifts for your purpose. Give us courage to work together as equals to proclaim your grace and hope. God of love, hear our prayer. Oh God, our greatest friend, surround us with your love and affirmation through the kindness of others, be they friend or stranger, young or old. Give us eyes to see and love you lavish on all your people. Make us bold to speak your truth and act on behalf of your kingdom with courage and strength of purpose. God of love, hear our prayer. God of understanding, give us courage to stand up for the abused, the needy, the sick, the poor, and the stranger. We pray for those who suffer in mind, body, or spirit, that you might bring healing and comfort. Inspire us to be your hands to provide for those who are in need as we are able. God of love, hear our prayer. O God, our healer and provider, we lift up the names of those for whom we pray, and for those online, you can place those names in the chat box. God of love. O God, our help through the ages, we thank you for the gifts of wisdom and insight brought to us through the lives of your saints. Inspire us by their witness as we continue their legacy of faith. God of love. Holy God of the universe, throughout history you've given us the courage to form and reform your church against all odds and into pathways as yet unknown. By your Spirit in unexpected ways, you have brought us to this place, in this circle of your love. Guide our ways that we may grow in faith and hope, and make us your bold and faithful servants this day and forevermore. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. And all would say, Amen. Let's join our hearts and hands as we sing Shalom for you, to you, Lord. Shalom to you now. Shalom, my friends. May our mercies bless you, my friends. In all your living and all your longing, Christ be your soul. Christ be your soul. Shalom to you now. Shalom, my friends. May all your mercies bless you, my friends. In all your living and through your longing, Christ be your soul. Christ be your soul. Okay, thanks so much for coming. We'll see you next Sunday.